It's so good to be here with Hannah back with us, joining us this morning, and then with Dr. Bill Longsworth joining us. Many of you know Dr. Longsworth, who's been in our church for many, many years on staff. I knew Bill, of course, back early on when I was a youth minister way back here, and over the years as I've been involved with First Methodist. But Lynn and I both took ethics class from Bill, a couple of ethics classes from Bill, at Bright Divinity School, where he was professor of ethics there. And one of my favorite classes that Bill taught was his course on Kierkegaard, Søren Kierkegaard, the Danish existential theologian and philosopher. And listening to this song made me think of Kierkegaard. Those of you who know Kierkegaard know he could be a little bit blue, a little dark at times, and he would completely understand the existential dilemma of running around in circles and living in the midst of a mad world, and how odd and how funny it might be, how actually quirky and funny it might be to say that the best dreams we've had were the dreams where we were dying. We're living in a mad world. Let's think about that in a minute. I want to tell you a quick story, and some of you might remember this story, but I think it illustrates well where I want to go this morning with this idea of finding creativity in response to the chaos that we find ourselves in sometimes. So some of you remember me talking about the Rabbi Baal Shem Tov. If you do, you remember that the Rabbi Baal Shem Tov was the founder of the Hasidic faith, sort of that mystical tradition of the Orthodox Jewish faith. In Islam, the mystical tradition was Sufism, which we have our welcome statement comes out of the Sufist tradition. But in the Christian tradition, in the conservative Christian tradition, you have this also mystical tradition that comes out in monasticism and in the contemplative movement. It seems like there is always this counterbalance to this right extremist kind of orientation to rigid rules and such, that there's something in the body, the larger body of this faith, that says there's got to be a way to connect with the divine present now, here. How do we do that? And so you have the Hasidic faith for the Jewish tradition, which is a phenomenal body of mystical rituals, but also wonderful stories. And so when the Baal Shem Tov, in the 1700s, when he was dying, he had these disciples, these devoted followers that would do anything and just lived off of every word that he said. But he was in his deathbed, and as he was laying there, they decided to be close to him for his final words before he moved beyond. And so they kind of gathered around him in order of sort of insight and wisdom and seniority. So the wisest ones were gathered closest, and then as the room filled up, the lesser and lesser sort of disciples, until down the hallway there were disciples waiting to hear what word the Baal Shem Tov, the Rebbe, had passed along, until they were out the door, and such a crowd had gathered that they were down the street, until there was somebody at the end that kind of wandered up, saw the crowd, and said, "What's happening?" And they said, "Well, the Rebbe is about to speak." And then they said, "Well, who's the Rebbe?" And they said, "Well, he's the wise teacher. He's the founder of our faith." And so he said, "Well, what's he going to say?" And they said, "Well, we don't know. Just stand in line, we'll tell you." And so, finally, after some time, the Rebbe, the Baal Shem Tov, opened his eyes, barely squinting through his eyes, and motioned for his wisest disciple to come toward him. And so the disciple leaned over, and he said, "Yes, Rebbe, what would you tell us? What would you tell us?" And the Rebbe looked up and said, "What I've been trying to say," I'm saying this in my really bad Jewish accent, "what I've been trying to say is that life is a bit like a river. It's a river. Life is like a river." And the Rebbe closed his eyes then and let out a short sigh and was breathing very shallowly. But the disciples pondered this for a moment and looked at one another until finally the closest one said, "Yes, of course. Of course, yes. Life is like a river. Life moves, it courses through whatever's happening. It changes things as it moves through life. It begins to flow, and sometimes it must change even its own boundaries as it flows along. And sometimes it takes along the boundaries with it, and it continues to flow and course and move and split and divide. And then this disciple began to pass that idea on to the next one, and then down to the next, and it went around the room 2 or 3 times. Yes, life is like a river. And then it went down the hallway, then it went out the door and down the street until sometime later it finally got to that stranger that just kind of showed up, and the person before him said, life is like a river. And then the guy at the inn said, what does that mean? What do you mean life is like a river? Why is life like a river? That doesn't make any sense. Ask the rabbi to explain what he means. Why is life like a river? Well, the question went back up. Honestly, the question went back up the street, and then it went up into the porch, and then into the hallway and around the room, until finally, after some time, they, with some caution, approached the rabbi, tapped him on the shoulder. Rabbi, master. And he said, what do you want now? And they said, Rabbi, we don't understand. What do you mean life is like a river? And then everyone waited with bated breath for his last teaching, when he opened his eyes and with one last gasp said, so who knows? Maybe it's not. So I want to think with you about change. And I want to think with you about this idea of seeing the world strange. And as funny as that joke is, and as funny as it sort of strikes us that all of this effort and this wise person, and suddenly even this wise person says, well, who knows? Maybe what I just said is just a bunch of bull. And who knows? Maybe it's not at all what I just said. You know, we listen to the world with certain anxieties, right? And we surround ourselves with certain communities and certain tribes and certain, I guess you would say, echo chambers. And when you think in terms of chaos, they think of this kinds of things as feedback. We surround ourselves in a certain way that the same kinds of patterns always happen. But like a river, we know patterns will eventually change. They can eventually change. Any number of things can happen. And next thing you know, something else begins to change that way of thinking or that way of living or the way our lives have been, some kind of conflict, some kind of crisis. And all of a sudden we're struck with this question, well, if we thought it was this way, then how come it's suddenly not this way? I mean, we have a great sermon illustration because last week, towards the end of the week, I suddenly dropped on Hannah this song. We just dropped it in her lap and said, we want you to do this one. We want you to do Gnarls Barkley. And we want you to do that song, Crazy, you know, I think I'm why is it crazy? Or however that goes. Anyway, I should not have done that, shouldn't I? Anyway, so she doesn't know it, and we just kind of dropped her at the last second. And so Brad calls me back, and he says, well, Tom, if you can't always have what you want, what about if you get what you need? And we're going like, well, that's an awesome song. Let's just do that song. And it just sort of happens, right? And it's really just the way life is in here in 1111. In fact, it's kind of the way we approach things, is we approach things with that sort of open-ended process as opposed to a closed system. We're open to begin to question things. And change is difficult. I mean, honestly, even just look at the simple ways we do things. Change is difficult. Sharma and I have talked about this before, and everybody knows, if you talk to me for any length of time, I'm fascinated with neuroscience, right? I'm fascinated with how the brain works. And I know just enough to be stupid. Really? You know, I know just enough to kind of get it wrong. So, last week I had said some things, and I already had some folks come up and said, well, you know, the way you were thinking about Rosa Parks, that's kind of the way that it once was reported, but it's not really true to history. And I'm going like, dang it, and Wikipedia I thought I had it, you know. And then someone comes up and says, well, you know, you're talking about chaos theory. And of course, I'm a mathematician, and so I know just enough to be excited and to be kind of dangerously stupid. So you have to even take that with more of the enthusiasm than with the insight and brilliance behind it. Because maybe if I'm enthusiastic enough, it will like make you want to go and find out what it really is and what it really means. But change is difficult. That enough we pretty much can agree on. And the fact is that our brains are wired for change to be difficult. Our brains are wired from our earliest evolution to kind of make things easy. You know, we needed to survive. So we're pretty much wired for survival, fight and flight. and then everything else is sort of funneled through that quick reaction. So we don't need to be processing a lot. Now, as we've evolved, our brains have gotten larger, whereas most animals don't. Well, I found this out, by the way. You can go check this out. This is interesting. I found out, you know why our brains began to enlarge faster than most other primates and why we got smarter? It's because we learned how to cook. Because we cook food, our food is processed faster. We can process it and digest it and process it biologically faster than animals who eat raw food. And so our brains developed more. Go check it out. Anyway, that was a total side thought. So like for example, we don't like change. You probably park in similar places every time you come here. You probably park in a similar place. When you go to the grocery store, you park probably in a similar place. When you go home from work, when you come to work, when you come to church, we have patterns. We follow these patterns. We have certain patterns in our rituals at home. We like the rituals, and we say they make us feel comfortable, and we say that's one less thing for me to have to worry about. But the reality is that our brains are kind of lazy. They don't want to have to process that stuff. Just think about how much time some of you spend looking in the closet and trying to figure out what you're going to wear for the day, right? I mean, now some of you spend more time than others. I can tell by looking. I can't believe I said that. But so, no, I mean, in all honesty, Steve Jobs and Einstein, and if you ever watched Adrian Monk, you know what they do. They have the same outfit every day. It was a no-brainer. Just go put on the same outfit, and that's all you have to worry about. When people go traveling sometimes, like on this Irish trip, some of the folks that we traveled with brought 3 things to wear. Basically, 3 things, women and guys, they brought the same kind of pants, the same shirts, and just 3 different things, maybe 4, and it made life so easy. And I remember one of them saying to me, that's been the best part of this trip. I just wake up, throw it on, and start out, and then the adventure's in front of me. But we worry about stuff, and it's hard for our brains because our brains have to sit there and think through what is going to happen. And Steve Jobs and others realized that just takes up brain power that the frontal lobe is going to need later for making more important decisions. It actually works that way. So in a sense, that's good. I mean, we need that kind of ease with which we do things. But it also explains why we like things black and white sometimes. Why we like answers black and white, why we like to what we call bifurcate our belief systems from our other kinds of things. Some of us might be doctors or lawyers, or we might otherwise be incredibly involved in analyzing our work, but we don't give any kind of attention like that to what we really think about God or theology or the world or why things happen or our worldview, because that's hard work. It's hard for our brains to go there, and so we take the easy route. And honestly, I'm grateful for the brains doing that. I admit that sometimes I say, you people should kind of mix it up and sit in different places. But you don't know how hard that is for me, what a nightmare that is for me, because then all of a sudden I look over and I'll go, well, there you are, and then I'll look at the person next to you and I'll go, oh my gosh, I'm thinking, is that your daughter? Do you have a daughter? Why aren't you normally sitting over here? And I look over there and I go, oh no, that's who I thought was over there. And all the while I'm trying to get an idea to you, and the band's coming up and they're ready to start playing. And then I realized you're not even who I thought you were in the first place. I appreciate the brain needing an easy way to go through things. But that's also what our text is about. This craziness that sometimes our life we find ourselves in. Whether we find it simply because we're trying to make our way home and traffic has gotten unbelievable, or whether it's your boss telling you that the company's been restructured and now your position has been eliminated, or whether it's a relationship crisis or a critical illness or a natural disaster, changes in life can be frightening at best and can be overwhelmingly devastating at worst. And in a sense, that's what our text is about this morning. Because Paul is essentially looking at the early church. And we think, oh, it's just a happy little community of early Christians getting together and having communion. But the Roman people are out to kill them. And the traditional Jewish orthodoxy hates and despises them. They have no community. And their leader, Paul, is almost always either in jail or about to be executed. So their lives are in chaos. And what does Paul tell them? Paul doesn't say, here's your rules, start following these rules. Paul says, your mind needs to be renewed. You need to change the way you think about things. Now, I know what it was like to grow up in a fundamentalist church or an evangelical church and be told exactly what that means to have your mind renewed. Because like everybody else, my brain doesn't want to do a whole lot of work. So if you'll just tell me what I need to believe and how I need to believe and what I need to do and what I need not to do and who is bad and who is good, we're all good. And that's what we got. But that's not what Paul's talking about. Paul's talking about renewing, transforming, everyday moments, things that happen from moment to moment, a new way of seeing things. And Paul says, by renewing your mind, or as the way that Eugene Peterson says it this morning, to lay our lives, our moments by moments, down before God. It's a way of seeing the world, a new way of seeing the world. And the four spiritual laws aren't going to get you there, because it needs to be a creative way. Do you remember in Exodus, you might have remembered, when Moses was leading the people out of Israel, right? Finally, the empire. We're going to have a new change of things, a new regime change. We're no longer under Pharaoh's rule. It was a similar idea that was going on for the early Christians. They figured initially that Jesus was going to bring about a whole new kingdom and it'd be a different empire. Of course, that didn't begin to happen. Didn't happen at all. And so then again, it was like we need to rethink things. Well, the people that were out in the wilderness, Moses came down with 10 laws and said, this will do, this will set us up. And they're already thinking, you know what, after a few months, after a year or two out here, this is pretty maddening. This is pretty chaotic. We had it better. Think about this. They were actually saying, we had it better when we were slaves. Well, if you've lived in the midst of chaos, if you've lived in the midst of a crisis, you're thinking oppressiveness isn't a bad thing. It can feel pretty good. It's nice having boundaries. It's nice not having to worry. It's nice having not to be afraid about things. In our life, if you look at our world, it's easy to get scared, right? I mean, it's one thing, but it's one thing to just be moment to moment dealing with crises and stresses that day to day happen. It's another thing to be overwhelmed by images of devastation or of death or of earthquakes or of ethnic genocide happening in Africa. It's easy to suddenly get overwhelmed. And what do we want to do? We kind of want to retreat. We kind of want to turn back to something very basic. Paul says, you need to renew your minds. You need to change the way you see things. So here's an idea I want to share with you. We got to get our head away from what we think truth is. We're in the middle of a conflict in our Methodist church, just like we're in the middle of a political conflict in our politics in the world, just like we're in the middle of the global politics that we always find ourselves in conflict with. And in our local little representation here in our little petri glass that we call the United Methodist Church, we can't come to terms with, we can't agree upon what it means. How do I say this? We can't agree on how we understand human sexuality in the church. And so we have this division, right? Now, right now, Casey Orr, one of our associates, is part of that 32-member global commission, and they're meeting in Berlin this next week. And they're going into the next stage of trying to understand how do we move forward? How do we move forward? When you're dealing with conflict, when you're dealing with crisis, what do you want to do? I want to move on. I want to move on. Well, that's the challenge, right? That's the challenge, is not to move on. Because the temptation will be that we don't change anything. How do you change the way you see the world? That's what has to happen. We have to change the way we see things. To move forward, we have to completely agree that we're going to look at things differently. Do you know what Paul Cézanne, who was the painter, right, the famous painter that basically moved us from Impressionism to post-Impressionism? When Paul Cézanne would do painting, do you know what he did? He looked at a painting, and he took the paintbrush, and before he would paint a stroke, he looked at his object, and before he would paint a stroke, he took and moved around it and looked at it again. He wasn't trying to paint another side of it. He was going to paint the same front side or the same angle he initially saw. But he continued to move in every direction around what he was looking at, the subject, in order to get different perspectives. And then with each new perspective, he laid a layer of paint on top of the previous layer. It would take him hundreds of hours to finish an individual painting. If you look at his paintings, you'll see the life that seems present in his paintings. Strange as the object may look, or as the person may look, or as the scene may look, because it is an post-impressionism, it has a life about it because, as he says, he would continually doubt what he just saw and try to see it again, and then paint. Philosophers came to call that Cézanne's doubt. That became sort of what they called his approach to painting, was his doubt. We have to transform the way we see the world. The way in which Rumi said was, he said, take your cleverness and sell your cleverness and buy bewilderment. The way Jesus would say is, you once heard it said, thou shalt not kill. It was on one of those tablets. But I tell you, if you hate someone, you're already murdering. What? I tell you, you should love your enemies. Now, wait. You didn't mean that. You meant my frenemies. I'm supposed to love my enemies that aren't really my enemies. They're kind of my friends. I'm just mad at them. Jesus said, love your enemies. You have to change the way you see the world. Cézanne's doubt. The way in which we are invited to respond to things that happen to us is not to retreat back into the way things used to be. Chaos, when it happens, doesn't invite us to suddenly think, well, I want to get it back to the way it was. We're not invited to make lemonade out of lemons. We're invited to sit with that lemon for a while, to see that lemon from all different perspectives, and to start realizing the lemon's not a lemon at all. The lemon's just a new way of being. The lemon's just a new way of thinking about things. It's just a new fruit I didn't know I didn't like, but now I'm going to learn to like a lemon. It's a way of transforming how we see. A woman told a story in one of the stories from Irma that I saw on Facebook, and I'm going to forget her name. But like a lot of the stories, she got caught in the storm. Couldn't get out of the storm. The flights had already all finished up and left. There were no more flights. She went back to her house. And in the story, she had buried herself under her mattress in the bathroom. And she recounted how the terror was that when she felt the house rattling, things flying all about, she would peek out from under the mattress and she'd just see the most bizarre, surrealistic reality around her with everything flying for just minutes. It seemed like minutes upon minutes that this reality had not left, that her room was just this spiral of chaos. And then she said she felt like the roof or something had just been ripped away, because the sound became more open. But she didn't look. She waited until things had calmed down. And she said she remembered pulling back the mattress. And she said what was strange was I expected to be completely in shock. But she said what I saw was the sky. And it was open. And for just a moment, she said, I saw stars between the clouds, and I felt a sense of peace. Now, we know that didn't last. We know that when she got up and she moved around and saw the chaos and the destruction, she was overwhelmed with the work in front of her. And she admitted that. But she ended by saying, I'm not going to forget the sudden view I had. There's an old Zen saying that goes like this. Once my barn burned down, I now have a much more beautiful view of the rising moon. What God invites us in the midst of life's challenges is to sit, to think. In the simplest of moments, in conversations one with another, don't go where you normally go. Don't hold to your normal position. Don't wait for your chance to say something. Sit in an open system. Sit with an openness that waits to see what you might learn or what we might hear.